Please, I need to go home. I need to see my mother one last time before the burial.
No, you're not going anywhere. The trip isn't worth the money.
For 12 years of marriage, Malik Cross believed with absolute certainty that he was the one holding his family together, while his wife, Nia Okafor, was nothing more than an ordinary accountant who lived quietly and never once complained. Then came the morning her mother died, and Malik coldly locked the accounts, canceled the plane ticket, and announced that she would not be allowed to attend the funeral because, in his words, the family could not afford it. He had no idea that the woman standing in front of him, a woman he had underestimated every single day of their life together, was the secret owner of a $50 billion fortune, and that his cruelty would cost him everything within 3 days. Malik Cross was 42 years old, a man who had built a mid-sized construction company from nothing but a pickup truck and a stubborn will. He wore his authority like a second skin, the kind of man who believed a household needed exactly one voice at the head of the table, and that voice belonged to him. He controlled every bank account, every bill, every decision that touched money, and he told himself this was leadership, not control. In his mind, he was the architect of everything good in their lives, the provider, the protector, the reason the lights stayed on, and the mortgage stayed paid. He rarely asked Nia what she thought about anything larger than dinner, because he had long ago decided her opinions on finance were unnecessary. It never occurred to him that a woman could carry an entire universe behind a quiet smile. Nia Okafor was 40 years old, gentle in a way that made people underestimate her instantly, the kind of gentleness that some mistook for weakness and others simply overlooked. She dressed simply, drove an older sedan, and packed her own lunch every single day, never once hinting that she could have owned the building she worked in and everyone inside it. She kept her past locked away with the same discipline she used to keep her composure, because she had learned long ago that people changed the moment they discovered what she was truly worth. She wanted to be loved for her laughter, her cooking, the way she remembered small things, not for a number attached to her name. So she buried the truth so deep that even her own husband never suspected there was anything left to find. Their marriage ran on an old, familiar rhythm, the kind that looked peaceful from the outside, but was quietly unbalanced underneath. Malik held every account, every card, every password, and Nia never once demanded access, never once raised her voice about it. He assumed this meant she agreed with the arrangement, that she was content being taken care of, when in truth she had simply chosen not to fight a battle that meant nothing to her. He told himself she earned very little, understood nothing about real finance, and was better off simply trusting his judgment. He never imagined that the woman across the dinner table understood markets and mergers on a level that would have made his accountant blush. There were signs, small ones, scattered across the years, like breadcrumbs Malik never bothered to follow. Nia often received calls from unfamiliar international numbers, calls she would silence the instant he walked into the room, her voice dropping to something careful and practiced. There were emails on her laptop written in language too formal for ordinary correspondence, sealed with signatures and encrypted attachments she closed the moment he glanced over her shoulder. Malik dismissed it all as spam, as nonsense, as nothing worth his attention, because in his mind there was nothing about his wife that could possibly be complicated. That dismissal, that casual arrogance, would haunt him more than he could have imagined. Friends who visited occasionally noticed small inconsistencies too, though none of them ever said a word aloud, because Nia had a way of deflecting questions with a warm laugh that closed the subject before it ever fully opened. A neighbor once mentioned seeing her step out of an unmarked car with tinted windows near the edge of town, and Nia simply explained it away as a ride from a coworker whose name nobody thought to ask about again. Another time, a package arrived addressed to a name that was almost, but not quite, her own, and when Malik asked about it, she said it was simply a clerical error from an old employer. Each explanation was small, plausible, forgettable on its own, yet together they formed a pattern that no one in that household ever stepped back far enough to see. Malik, certain of his own understanding of the woman he had married, never once considered that the pattern might be intentional, carefully built brick by brick over more than a decade. At night, after Malik had fallen asleep beside her, Nia sometimes lay awake staring at the ceiling, carrying the quiet exhaustion of a woman living two entirely separate lives. By day, she answered to boards and shareholders scattered across different time zones, her decisions moving markets she could never mention over dinner. By evening, she folded laundry, packed lunches, and asked her husband how his day at the job site had gone, listening with genuine interest to stories about permits and subcontractors. She had chosen this division herself, had built the wall between those two worlds with her own hands, and for years she believed the sacrifice was worth the ordinary happiness it bought her. She only began to wonder, quietly and without saying so, whether a love that required so much hiding could ever truly be called love at all. The phone rang a little after midnight, and the number on the screen carried a country code from Nigeria that made Nia's stomach drop before she even answered. The voice on the other end was her cousin, trembling, delivering the words no daughter is ever ready to hear, that her mother had passed away after months of quietly losing a battle with heart disease. Nia had known her mother was ill, had sent money quietly for treatments Malik never knew existed, but nothing had prepared her for the finality of that call. She slid down against the kitchen wall, phone pressed to her ear, and the only words she could manage through her sobs were that she needed to go home, that she needed to see her mother one last time before the burial. It was the most vulnerable Malik had ever seen her in 12 years of marriage. He walked into the kitchen already reaching for his phone, not to comfort her, but to check flight prices, and the calculation happening behind his eyes was visible even through his forced expression of sympathy. He muttered about airfare, about hotel costs in a foreign country, about how funerals overseas always seem to come with hidden expenses that families back home never anticipated. Nia looked up at him, eyes swollen, and asked him only for understanding, only for permission to grieve the way any daughter deserved to grieve. Instead, Malik delivered the words that would later be replayed in his mind like a curse, telling her flatly that the trip was not worth the money. He said it without flinching, that a dead woman would not know whether her daughter stood over the grave or not, that grief was something you could carry from a distance just as easily as up close. Nia stared at him, as though seeing him for the first time, searching his face for some trace of the man she had chosen to marry, some flicker of compassion buried beneath the arithmetic. There was none, only the same steady, businesslike expression he wore when negotiating a contract, as if her mother's death were simply another line item to be managed. She said nothing more that night, retreating instead into a silence that Malik mistook for surrender, when in truth it was the sound of something inside her, finally, quietly breaking. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone weeks earlier, tired but still full of warmth, telling her not to worry too much, that everything would be fine, the way mothers so often say, even when they suspect it will not be. She thought about the years spent building bridges of wealth and influence across entire continents, while somehow never finding the words to tell her own husband that her mother was dying. She had told herself there would be time later, time to explain everything once the crisis passed. And now that time had collapsed into nothing, replaced by the cold, unbearable finality of a phone call in the dark. Grief pressed down on her chest like a physical weight, and beneath it, unnoticed at first, something else began to stir. Something that felt almost like clarity. She realized, sitting on that kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets, that she had spent 12 years protecting Malik from a truth that might have changed everything, and in return he had shown her, without hesitation, exactly how he valued her pain when it came with a price tag attached. It was not simply that he refused the money for the flight, though even that alone would have wounded her deeply. It was the ease with which he refused it, the total absence of hesitation, as though her mother's death barely registered, as worth the inconvenience of rearranging a budget. That ease told her more about the true architecture of their marriage than 12 years of quiet evenings ever had. What Malik could not see, what he had never once cared to look for, was the storm gathering behind his wife's calm eyes, a storm built from years of swallowed pride and unspoken power. Somewhere far beyond that kitchen, phones were already beginning to ring in offices across continents, assistants already being told to prepare, calendars already being cleared for a woman whose name carried more weight in certain rooms than his entire company ever would. Malik went to bed that night, believing he had simply made a practical decision, a fair and reasonable choice for the good of their household budget. He had no idea he had just insulted one of the most powerful women in the world, and that the consequences were already in motion before the sun rose again. By morning, Malik had convinced himself the matter was settled, and he moved through his routine with the brisk efficiency of a man certain he had won an argument. He canceled the plane ticket Nia had tentatively booked days earlier, calling the airline himself before she woke, taking a strange satisfaction in exercising control over a decision that was never truly his to make. He froze the joint credit card, not out of malice exactly, but out of habit, the same reflex he used whenever he wanted to remind Nia who held the final word in their household. Then, almost as an afterthought, he slipped her passport into his desk drawer and locked it, telling himself it was simply safer there, though both of them understood exactly what the gesture meant. When Nia found the passport missing, she asked him plainly where it had gone, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. Malik answered without hesitation, reminding her that he was the man of the house, that decisions of this magnitude belonged to him, and that he had already decided the trip would not happen. He said the words as though they were simply facts of nature, immovable and beyond question, the same way he might announce that the sky was blue. Nia's eyes filled with tears, but she did not argue, did not raise her voice, did not remind him that the money in question was money he had never once had to worry about providing. She simply nodded, turned away, and let him believe he had won. That evening, once Malik had left for a late meeting with a supplier, Nia sat alone in the quiet of their bedroom and finally allowed herself to breathe. She picked up a second phone, one Malik had never seen in 12 years of marriage, a phone that lived hidden inside a shoebox at the back of her closet. She dialed a number from memory, her fingers steady now, her voice quiet but absolutely certain, and when the call connected, she said only 4 words into the receiver that it was time. On the other end, a composed, formal voice answered immediately, as though it had been waiting for this exact call for years, responding simply that they understood, "Madam." There was no hesitation, no request for clarification, only the immediate, practiced efficiency of people who had clearly been trained to respond the moment she gave the word. Nia closed her eyes, tears sliding silently down her face. Grief and something else entirely, something like release, mixing together in that single breath. She had spent 12 years protecting a secret so that she could be loved simply as herself, and now, in the wake of her mother's death, that protection no longer mattered to her at all. The following morning arrived with an unfamiliar sound outside the house, the low, expensive hum of engines that did not belong to any vehicle in their quiet suburban neighborhood. Malik stepped onto the porch in his robe, coffee in hand, and found a procession of black luxury vehicles parked along the curb, drivers standing at attention beside each one. He assumed immediately they had the wrong address, some mix-up meant for a wealthier street across town, and he walked toward the lead car, already prepared to redirect them. A man in a tailored suit stepped forward instead, polite but formal, and asked whether this was the residence of Madame Nia Okafor. Malik blinked, caught entirely off guard by the title, by the reverence in the man's voice when he said her name. He answered that yes, Nia lived there, though he quickly added, almost defensively, that she was simply his wife, as though the clarification would explain away the confusion. The driver and the men beside him exchanged a brief, unreadable glance, the kind of look shared by people who know something the person in front of them does not. None of them offered an explanation, only repeating that they had been sent to assist Madame Okafor with whatever she required, and that they would wait as long as necessary. Malik turned back toward the house, calling for Nia, his confusion now edged with irritation, demanding to know what exactly was happening on his own front lawn. Nia appeared in the doorway, pale from crying, and when she saw the cars, her expression shifted into something composed, almost practiced, a mask Malik had never once seen her wear before. She stepped outside just far enough to address the men directly, thanking them quietly but telling them she was not yet ready, that she needed more time before anything could proceed. They nodded without argument, retreated to their vehicles, and waited at a respectful distance, leaving Malik standing on the porch with more questions than he had ever had about the woman he married. He followed her back inside, peppering her with questions she refused to answer, asking again and again who those men were and why they had spoken to her as though she were royalty. Nia only told him it was complicated, that she would explain everything once the funeral was behind them, and that for now she needed him to trust her. Malik, unaccustomed to being denied answers in his own home, felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest, a small, uncomfortable seed of doubt about a wife. He had always assumed he understood completely. He had no idea that seed would grow, within days, into the collapse of everything he believed about his life. 12 years earlier, long before she ever met Malik Cross, Nia Okafor had built and sold a clean energy technology company that revolutionized how small nations approached power infrastructure. The sale itself had been staggering, but it was the decade that followed, filled with careful reinvestment, strategic partnerships, and a portfolio spread across continents that transformed her fortune into something almost unimaginable. By the time she walked down the aisle to marry Malik, her holdings had already crossed the threshold of $50 billion, a number so large that even the people managing it for her rarely said it aloud. She chose, deliberately and with full awareness of what she was giving up, to never speak a word of it to the man she loved. Her reasoning was simple, though it had cost her more than anyone around her ever understood, because she wanted desperately to be loved for who she was, rather than for what she owned. She had watched wealth destroy relationships before, watched people transform the instant they learned what she was worth, their affection curdling into something transactional and hollow. So when she met Malik, a hard-working man with rough hands and an easy laugh, she saw an opportunity to simply be Nia, nothing more and nothing less. A woman building a life, rather than managing an empire. She told him she worked in accounting, which was technically true, since she did in fact oversee the books of several foundations, just not in the modest way he assumed. Behind that careful disguise, she never stopped working, never stopped building, quietly directing investments, through trusted intermediaries who understood the importance of her privacy. She funneled enormous sums into humanitarian causes, funding clean water initiatives across 3 continents and establishing microloan programs that helped thousands of women launch small businesses from nothing. She sat on boards under corporate structures that obscured her personal name, attended summits, disguised behind formal titles that meant nothing to anyone outside her closest circle. Every trip she claimed was for ordinary work. Every late night she blamed on tax season was in truth another thread in a vast financial tapestry Malik never once thought to examine. He never asked to see her pay stubs, never questioned why her modest salary seemed to stretch further than it should, never wondered why she carried herself with a quiet, unshakable confidence that had nothing to do with the life he thought they were living. He was too consumed with his own sense of control, too certain that everything of value in their household flowed from his hands, to ever imagine the truth sitting across the dinner table from him every single night. Nia had built one of the largest private fortunes in the world, and she had done it entirely in the shadow of a man who believed he was the one carrying her. The company she had founded, and later sold, began as little more than an idea scratched onto a napkin during her final year of graduate school. A proposal for affordable solar infrastructure in regions the larger corporations considered too small to matter. She spent her 20s chasing that idea across continents, sleeping in modest guest houses, convincing skeptical investors one meeting at a time, refusing every offer that asked her to compromise the mission at the heart of her work. By the time competitors realized what she had built, it was already too late for them to catch up, and the acquisition offers began arriving faster than she could evaluate them. She chose her buyer carefully, not for the highest price, but for the promise that her technology would continue reaching the communities it was designed to serve, and only then did she finally agree to sell. What followed was a decade of careful, almost invisible expansion, as she reinvested the proceeds into a diversified portfolio spanning renewable energy, emerging market finance, and a quiet but growing stake in several technology firms whose names would later become household words. She surrounded herself with a small circle of trusted advisors bound by strict confidentiality, people who understood that her privacy was not vanity but survival, a shield against a world that too often treated wealthy women as targets rather than architects. Even as her fortune climbed past 10 billion, then 20, then well beyond that, she continued living in ways that revealed nothing, driving unremarkable cars, wearing simple clothing, choosing neighborhoods where no one would think to look twice at her. It was, in its own way, one of the most disciplined performances anyone had ever sustained, a woman hiding an empire behind the ordinary rhythms of a modest life. For a full day, Malik allowed himself to believe the matter had resolved itself quietly, that Nia had accepted his decision and let go of the idea of attending her mother's funeral. She had grown quiet, withdrawn into herself in a way he mistook for defeat rather than what it truly was, a woman conserving her strength for what was coming. He went about his business as usual, checking job sites, signing invoices, feeling a small, petty satisfaction that his authority in the household remained intact. That satisfaction lasted exactly until the moment a private jet descended onto the small regional airstrip outside their town, drawing the attention of half the neighborhood. It had not come to collect anyone for a flight overseas, as Malik briefly assumed with a flicker of panic, but rather to carry something far more solemn, arriving to transport the body of Nia's mother back to a memorial site maintained by the Okafor family for generations. Malik stood at the edge of the tarmac, uninvited but unable to look away, as the aircraft's doors opened and a procession of somber attendants emerged with practiced precision. It was only then, watching strangers move with such reverence around his wife, that the full scale of what he did not know began to dawn on him. He realized, with a cold, sinking clarity, that he understood almost nothing about the woman he had spent 12 years living beside. The scene that unfolded before him defied every assumption he had built his marriage upon, because gathered near the aircraft were men and women whose faces he recognized from magazine covers and business news broadcasts he rarely watched closely. There were foreign dignitaries standing in quiet clusters, prominent business leaders exchanging low, respectful words, representatives from international funds whose names carried weight in rooms Malik had never been invited into. Every single one of them was there, unmistakably, waiting for Nia, watching the doorway of the house as though she were the center of gravity around which the entire gathering revolved. Malik felt his legs grow unsteady beneath him, the ground of his certainty shifting in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. An older man in a dark, immaculately tailored suit approached the house and addressed the household staff with practiced formality, announcing that the Okafor family had been waiting for their matriarch. Malik, standing just inside the doorway, heard the words land in the air like a verdict. Matriarch, a title that belonged to someone far greater than the quiet, unassuming woman he had spent over a decade underestimating. He turned to look at Nia, standing composed in simple black clothing amid a sea of wealth and power that clearly recognized her as its center, and for the first time in his life, Malik Cross had absolutely nothing to say. It was an international attorney, calm and precise, who finally stepped forward to explain what Malik could no longer avoid understanding, laying out the truth in language too clear to misinterpret. He announced, with the measured tone of a man accustomed to delivering enormous news, that Nia Okafor was chairwoman of a global investment conglomerate spanning energy, technology, and finance. She was also, he continued, the founder of a humanitarian foundation responsible for clean water and education initiatives across dozens of countries, and a principal shareholder in several corporations, whose names Malik recognized instantly from his own daily life. The combined value of her holdings, the attorney stated plainly, exceeded $50 billion. Malik stood frozen, the number settling over him like a physical weight, pressing the air from his lungs in a way no business failure ever had. His mind raced backward through 12 years of memory, replaying every trip Nia had ever taken under the guise of routine work obligations, every late-night flight he had barely questioned. He remembered her mentioning conferences in Davos without elaboration, quiet weeks away that she attributed to auditing work in London, sudden trips to Singapore and Dubai that he now understood had nothing to do with any accounting firm. He had never once asked for details, never once wondered why an ordinary employee traveled with such frequency to the exact cities where the world's wealthiest gathered. The realization arrived in waves, each one more humiliating than the last, because Malik understood now that his failure had never been ignorance alone, but a willful refusal to see his wife as a full and complete person. He had built an entire identity around being the provider, the decision-maker, the man whose judgment could not be questioned, and that identity had blinded him to the truth standing beside him every single day. The attorney continued speaking, outlining trusts and foundations and boards, but Malik heard only fragments, his attention consumed by the crushing awareness of his own smallness in comparison to what his wife had built. Every dismissive word he had ever spoken to her, every casual assumption about her limitations, replayed in his mind with unbearable clarity. Around them, the gathered dignitaries and business leaders offered quiet condolences to Nia, treating her with a deference Malik had never once shown, addressing her not as someone's wife, but as a figure of genuine consequence in the world. He stood at the edge of that circle, an outsider in his own marriage, watching the woman he had controlled for over a decade reveal herself as someone who had, in truth, never needed his permission for anything at all. The house that had once felt like his domain now felt foreign, as though the walls themselves had been holding a secret the entire time. Malik Cross, for the first time in his adult life, understood exactly what it felt like to be powerless. In the quiet hours after the crowd dispersed, Malik found Nia standing alone near the memorial garden being prepared for her mother, and he approached with the closest thing to humility he had ever offered another human being. He apologized, the words stumbling out of him awkwardly, unfamiliar in his mouth, after years of never needing to say them, insisting he had not known that he would have acted differently had he understood who she truly was. Nia listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, until he finished, and then she asked him a single question that would remain with him for the rest of his life. She asked whether, if she had remained forever the ordinary woman he believed her to be, he would still be standing there apologizing. Malik opened his mouth to answer, and found nothing there, no honest response he could offer that would not condemn him further, and his silence stretched long enough to become an answer in itself. Nia nodded slowly, as though she had expected exactly this, as though some quiet part of her had always known the truth would eventually surface in a moment, just like this one. The pain on her face was not about wealth, was never about the $50 billion sitting in accounts across the world, and Malik understood that distinction, even as it devastated him. Her grief was rooted somewhere far deeper, in the discovery that the man she had chosen to love had revealed, in her darkest hour, exactly where his priorities truly lived. She explained to him, quietly and without cruelty, that she had spent 12 years hoping he loved her simply for herself, for her laughter and her patience, and the small, ordinary rhythms of their shared life. She had wanted a marriage untouched by the corrupting influence of money, a partnership built on something more durable than numbers in an account, and she had believed, for a long time, that she had found it in him. But when her mother lay dying an ocean away, when she needed nothing more than compassion and support, Malik had chosen arithmetic over empathy, had weighed her grief against airfare, and found her grief wanting. That choice, more than any secret fortune, was the truth that finally broke something irreparable between them. Malik tried once more to explain himself, to offer context or excuse, but Nia raised a hand gently and told him there was nothing left to explain, that his answer had already been given in the moment he refused to let her go. She turned back toward the garden, toward the fresh earth being prepared to receive her mother, and Malik understood with sickening clarity that he had lost something far more valuable than any fortune. He had lost the one thing money could never buy back, the genuine, unguarded love of a woman who had chosen him freely before he ever knew what she was worth. Later that evening, the attorney returned to the house carrying a sealed letter, explaining gently that Nia's mother had written it years earlier, with strict instructions that it be read only after her passing, and only in the presence of her daughter. The family gathered in the quiet study, and the attorney unfolded the pages carefully, his voice steady as he began to read the words of a mother who had clearly understood far more about her daughter's life than anyone realized. The letter spoke of pride, of a mother's fierce love for a daughter who had built an empire from nothing, but it also carried a warning, one written with the aching wisdom of someone who had watched her child hide herself away for the sake of love. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. The letter said that if her daughter ever felt forced to hide her own worth in order to be loved, then whoever required that hiding had never truly loved her at all. It went on to say that real love did not ask a person to shrink themselves, did not require silence or disguise, or the burying of one's own achievements, and that a partner worthy of her daughter's heart would have celebrated her strength rather than needing to control it. Nia listened with tears sliding freely down her face, the composure she had maintained through the entire ordeal finally giving way completely. It was the first time she had cried without restraint since the news of her mother's death first reached her. She understood, hearing those words read aloud, that her mother had seen the truth of her marriage long before Nia herself had been willing to admit it, that a mother's instinct had recognized danger in a relationship built on concealment and control. The letter was not written out of anger toward Malik specifically, but out of a lifetime of watching her daughter navigate a world that too often demanded women make themselves smaller to be accepted. Nia realized that her mother had died, believing in her daughter's strength completely, trusting that whatever pain the truth eventually caused, Nia would find her way through it, with the same resilience she had shown her entire life. That trust settled over her like a final gift, one last act of maternal faith delivered from beyond the grave. Malik sat at the edge of the room throughout the reading, saying nothing, the weight of every word pressing down on him with unbearable precision, as though the letter had been written with him, specifically in mind. He recognized himself in every line describing a love that demanded concealment, a partnership that required a woman to hide her own magnitude in order to remain palatable. In that moment, listening to a dead woman's final wisdom fill the quiet study, Malik finally understood the full scope of what he had lost. It was not the $50 billion that haunted him, but the certainty that he had failed to love a woman who had only ever wanted to be seen. In the days following the funeral, Nia returned to the house she had shared with Malik for 12 years, carrying herself with a quiet steadiness that surprised even those closest to her. She did not raise her voice, did not seek to humiliate him publicly, did not use even a fraction of her considerable power to punish the man who had once locked her passport in a drawer. Instead, she moved through the process with a calm, deliberate dignity, meeting with her own attorneys to finalize the paperwork that would end their marriage cleanly and without spectacle. She wanted no headlines, no public reckoning, only a clean and final closing of a chapter that had already taught her everything she needed to know. When the divorce documents were prepared, Nia made one decision that surprised the lawyers working on her behalf, choosing to leave Malik the modest family home they had shared, along with the small savings that had always technically belonged to their household. She took back none of the gifts she had given him over the years, none of the vehicles or watches or small luxuries she had quietly funded without his knowledge of their true source. Her attorneys advised her that she was entitled to far more, that the law and simple fairness both supported a much harsher settlement, but Nia waved the suggestions away without hesitation. She had never wanted his money, and she had no intention of taking anything from him now, even as she walked away from the marriage entirely. On the last afternoon before she left, Nia stood in the doorway of the home they had built together, watching Malik sit motionless at the kitchen table where they had shared a decade of ordinary meals. She told him, in a voice free of bitterness, that the money had never been the greatest secret she carried in their marriage, that $50 billion had always mattered far less to her than the world seemed to assume it should. The real secret, she confessed, was that she had believed, foolishly perhaps, that love alone could reshape a person, that patience and devotion could soften even the hardest edges of control. She had learned, in the cruelest possible way, that some things cannot be loved into changing, and that a person's true character reveals itself most clearly in the moments that cost them nothing to hide. Malik watched her walk out that door for the final time, carrying nothing but a single suitcase, leaving behind a house full of memories that now felt hollow and strange without her presence inside them. He spent the following months in a fog of regret, replaying every dismissive comment, every locked account, every moment he had chosen control over compassion, understanding too late that respect could not be reclaimed once it had been so thoroughly destroyed. Nia, meanwhile, returned to the full weight of her empire, guiding her companies and foundations with the same quiet confidence she had always carried, only now without the burden of hiding who she truly was. She established a scholarship fund in her mother's name, dedicated to supporting young women pursuing careers in science and engineering across the very communities where she herself had once been overlooked. Months later, on a quiet morning, marked by soft light and the sound of birds settling into the trees above her mother's resting place, Nia knelt beside the freshly carved headstone and laid down a simple bouquet of white lilies. She stayed there for a long while, tears tracing down her cheeks even as a small, genuine smile settled across her face, the kind of expression that belongs only to those who have finally chosen themselves over everything else. She had lost a marriage, but she had reclaimed something far more essential, the freedom to stand fully in her own worth without apology or disguise. And as the wind moved gently through the garden, carrying with it the memory of a mother's final, unwavering love, Nia Okafor rose to her feet, ready to build the next chapter of a life that finally, completely, belonged to her alone. In the years that followed, her name began appearing publicly, in ways it never had before, not because she sought recognition, but because she had finally stopped hiding the scope of what she had built. The scholarship fund established in her mother's memory grew far beyond its original vision, eventually supporting thousands of young women pursuing degrees in engineering, medicine, and finance across communities that had once dismissed their potential. She spoke at universities occasionally, Always briefly, always with the same message, telling young women in the audience that their worth was never meant to be hidden in exchange for acceptance, that real love asks nothing to be concealed. Each time she delivered those words, she thought of her mother's letter, of the wisdom contained in those final pages, and she felt the weight of that inheritance settle into something like purpose. Malik, for his part, watched her rise from a distance he had no right to close. Reading about her achievements in the same news outlets that once meant nothing to him, recognizing too late the magnitude of what he had dismissed as ordinary, he rebuilt his company slowly, quietly, carrying with him a humility he had never possessed during their marriage, a humility purchased at the highest possible cost. He never remarried, and those who knew him said he rarely spoke of Nia at all, except on the rare occasions when someone asked him, almost as a test, what he would change if given the chance to live those years again. His answer was always the same, delivered without excuse, that he would have asked more questions and assumed far less, that he would have chosen curiosity over control before it ever cost him everything that mattered. The story of Malik Cross and Nia Okafor traveled quietly through certain circles for years afterward, told not as gossip, but as a kind of parable, a reminder that true worth rarely announces itself, and that the way a person treats someone they believe to be powerless reveals the truest measure of their character. Nia herself never spoke of it publicly, never used the story to elevate herself further, content instead to let her work speak in ways her silence once could not. She built, she gave, she healed, and in the quiet hours when the empire finally rested, she remembered her mother's words, that love should never require a person to disappear in order to be kept. It was, in the end, the only inheritance that had ever truly mattered, and she carried it forward into every decision that followed, unshaken, unafraid, and finally, entirely her own.